Dr. Maciej Bartkowski is the Senior Director for Education and Research at ICNC. At ICNC, Dr. Bartkowski manages academic programs for students, faculty, and educators that support curriculum development, teaching, research, writing, and study on civil resistance. He is the editor of the ICNC monograph series and the volume Recovering Nonviolent History, Civil Resistance and Liberation Struggles. He's also an adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins University, Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, and at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He has authored and co-authored numerous books and papers on the topics of civil resistance, including Recovering Nonviolent History, Civil Resistance and Liberation Struggles and Nation-Making, Nonviolent Civil Defense to Counter Russian Hybrid Warfare, and Nonviolent Revolutions, Struggles for Political Recognition and Democratic Transitions, among others. And with that, I will now pass full control over to Maciej.
David, thank you so much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening for some of you who are joining us from different countries. It's great to have you here and engage with you in conversation about the topic that is, I think, not well understood. It's not well explained, even though the origin of the conversation about nonviolent defense goes to the Cold War and immediately after the Second World War in the 1950s, when a number of researchers brought the concept of civilian-based defense, or what I call nonviolent defense, into the conversation about possible non-military strategies for national defense. So this is I think a rich history, but not many people are aware of that, and I think that the current discussion offers an opportunity to have a fresh look at the applicability of nonviolent civil resistance in national defense, and that's what I will be focusing on. We'll also have a couple of polls that we set up during this presentation to kind of both entertain you, but as well as educate all of us in the conversation about the subject matter. So first of all, I set up a couple of questions that are in essence an outline of our discussion. First one is how to really begin a serious conversation about nonviolent resistance strategies in national defense that is naturally dominated by military approaches. And I think that one way to start such conversation is to execute national surveys. And from those national surveys, the results that could be derived from those national surveys might provide opportunity for a public discussion that could be centered around civil resistance. And I will be referring to some national surveys that were done to illustrate that. Another question is, can attacked countries be more successful in defending against invasion and undermining occupation if they choose to use massive nonviolent resistance instead of, for example, relying on armed resistance? And here the answer, I would say, at this moment is that it depends. It depends on how the success of that defense is understood. And related to that is how the goals of national defense are defined and how the costs of maintaining or carrying on this national defense are compared between different types of defenses. And I will come back to the issue of costs and long-term consequences while looking at the essentially two types of defense, armed and unarmed defense, a bit later. Third question is, why should democratic states and citizens take nonviolent resistance strategies seriously to start with? And I think for me the simple answer is that if not for other reason, then because the bad state actors out there, they already do. And I will briefly talk about hybrid war that Russia is engaging in those days that integrate nonviolent strategies. And finally, is it feasible to integrate nonviolent resistance into national defense? And if so, how? And I think the resounding answer is yes. And in my view, Lithuania shows the way. And I will talk about how Lithuanian government integrated conceptually and practically nonviolent resistance into their national defense. So a question that I would like to start with is why nonviolent resistance is so rarely considered as a viable option for national defense. And I think this starts from that kind of skepticism, starts from how we look at unarmed people and how policy and military planners are looking at unarmed people in a war context. So unarmed people are basically looked at as victims and oftentimes collateral damage of the military campaign. And if they have certain agency, that agency is really merely confined to being assistants to ongoing war efforts. And certainly they are not viewed as a kind of independent, self-standing, autonomous, and potentially powerful agency during violent conflict, which in fact, when we talk about nonviolent defense, this what would need to happen. This kind of presupposition that unarmed people are powerful agency, independent, and can influence things on the ground, even in war context. This is what nonviolent defense would presuppose to start with. Another hurdle for nonviolent resistance in the context of national defense is the misconceptions about nonviolent resistance and a certain bureaucratic turf battle. When I conversed with some policy, in particular policy experts, about nonviolent resistance, those policy experts that were more immersed in armed defense planning, they, in essence, were looking into nonviolent or understanding nonviolent resistance as a form of defeatist and almost equaling surrender to the country that would invade a state that considered nonviolent defense. They would associate nonviolent resistance with pacifist views that in fact undermine spirit of resistance and cannot be as such integrated in national defense. In a more kind of bureaucratic turf battle understanding, that they express concern that if one starts discussing or, for God forbid, planning for nonviolent resistance as part of national defense, this would be a distraction from obtaining more arms and more resources for military and armed defense. And of course, those comments raise both frustrations on my end, as well as determination that there might be, or we should find ways to discuss or to bring up the applicability of nonviolent resistance even in national defense policies, despite all those obstacles, and we need to find a way how to do that. So one way is to, I think, discuss costs and long-term consequences of different types of defense, be it armed defense and nonviolent defense. And I think I found a relevant quote to illustrate this cause in the context of Second World War, and this quote comes from a book, Unarmed Against Hitler by Jacques Samlin, and it's a quote from a Polish anti-occupation resistor, who I think in a very brief and apt fashion captured the way we should look into various types of defenses and resistances in this case under occupation, in order to judge the effectiveness or applicability. And to read quickly that quote, he says that underground teaching on all levels of schooling was the most admirable work accomplished by Polish society during the occupation in the Second World War. Neither violence nor sabotage were as productive as this last manifestation of the national consciousness. It saved our society from a catastrophe equal at least to the destruction of Warsaw. We had 5 graduating classes of engineers, architects, doctors, teachers, and students who managed to pass the baccalaureate exams despite the German occupation and war. And I think this captures well the tension that this survival of the resistance talks about. The essentially long-term consequences that are set up by the type of resistance undertaken, and how they compare if one uses arms and if one organizes without violence. This was an example of parallel institution building, which are part of the nonviolent resistance repertoire of actions that he thought were the most effective. He used the word productive, and I think it captures quite a lot in a possible, I think, conversation about the costs of violent vis-a-vis non-violent defense. How productive this could be, short, mid, and long term for the society. So this is one kind of short, I think, opening in the conversation about why nonviolent resistance and more precisely nonviolent defense could be and should be a viable option for national defense because of the costs and because of the long-term consequences for the society, which might be much more propitious and beneficial with the use of nonviolent defense than with the use of armed defense. Now, I wanted to start from a poll that we would conduct with the participants that joined this webinar before I talk about the national surveys that were conducted in Poland and Ukraine. So, David, I will ask you to open the first poll. So the question is, what would you do if foreign troops invaded and occupied your town, city, region, and country? And well, 7% said that it would escape the conflict zone, which is quite reasonable. 7% said that it would take up arms. No one chose to surrender. We've got a very kind of active group that joined our webinar. No one said that it would collaborate with the occupier, and 86% said that they will join nonviolent resistance. I mean, this is very already committed group. Somehow I'm preaching to a choir here. So kind of keeping in mind the results for this group, here is the survey that asks similar question in Poland in 2015. So that was on the kind of eve of annexation, or a year after annexation of Crimea by Russia, and a kind of increasing worry about Russian kind of policies and Russian military stance in the region. That in Poland, those concerns were about, in essence, possible war with Russia and possible kind of attack on the Baltic states, and then that may spill over to Poland. So one of the national TV stations in Poland conducted that survey, asking Poles to imagine the situation if their country is attacked militarily and how would they behave. So 27% of Poles said that they would take up arms, 37% said that they would engage in nonviolent resistance, and 19% said that they would leave the country, 5% that they would surrender, and around more than 10% that they don't know. Now, that's, as I said, our group is a kind of committed group to nonviolent resistance, so it was not surprising that we reached almost 90% of the responses. However, I think for national survey, those results were still very surprising, given this large support for the option of nonviolent resistance, which received 37%. It's surprising on one level because Poles are known of romanticizing and glorifying the armed resistance against foreign invaders, starting from the kind of anti-occupation or anti-partition struggles and armed uprisings in the 19th century to armed resistance during the Second World War. So in that sense, it was surprising, this level of support for nonviolent resistance. On the other hand, it might be less surprising, given also a history of nonviolent resistance that Poles engaged and very successfully, that led to the creation of 10 million strong movement, solidarity movement, that successfully took on communist regime that was backed up by Soviet power and Soviet military. At the time of the rise of solidarity at the beginning of the 80s, there was around 80,000 Soviet troops on the Polish soil. So this resistance was both kind of domestic as well as external, this nonviolent resistance. Still, it was interesting to see the discussion in the TV studio after those polls were conducted, and the journalists completely missed this 37% of kind of the society being ready to engage in unarmed resistance, and they were kind of musing about the number of 27% of those who wanted to take up arms, asking themselves why so many people wanted to take up arms, given that Poland has a professional army and the responsibility of the professional army is to defend with arms the country, not the responsibility of the civilian. So they completely missed the opportunity, I think, to ask the public as well as policy makers the question that if we look at the defense kind of planning of the Polish state, it's predominantly focused on armed defense. And if one would measure the number of or the amount of resources, financial, human resources that are spent in preparation of defense, 99% would be are spent on military defense. And this contrasts with the fact that almost one-third of the society is prepared to engage in a completely different type of resistance that military planners or the defense planners are not really considering and not really planning for and not really spending resources on, which is nonviolent resistance. And this national survey, if it was used effectively, I think, could have opened the discussion and questions both to the public as well as to the kind of policy establishment, why Poland spends so much money on armed defense if Poles are prepared to engage in something different. Actually, majority of Poles are prepared to engage in something different. Similar survey with similar question was conducted in the same year, in fall, in Ukraine, and the results were even more, I think, interesting and maybe surprising, given that Ukrainians are feeling that they are already engaged in war with Russia. And so there is a lot of kind of national drumbeat about defense of the nation, about protecting the territory, protecting the country against foreign intervention, which that kind of rhetoric would suggest that people would be more ready to take up arms because there is such a kind of popular popular view that one needs to be ready to defend the country. Still, even in this kind of climate, there was around 1/3 of the population chose nonviolent resistance over armed resistance in kind of fending off armed intervention or eventual occupation. And still, I think that that survey provided and still provides opportunity for Ukrainian activists and those in Ukraine who are thinking about nonviolent resistance to raise the question with their politicians if there is such a potential for nonviolent resistance actions. What is the planning for it? If we see those representative surveys conducted that indicate, the readiness of the society to fight foreign aggression without violence, then how do we accommodate for that in our planning? How do we even kind of recognize this? And this is still a number of Ukrainian, I think, activists are trying to raise this issue using specifically this national survey results. Now we can conduct the second poll. Good. So around 50% said that it can be effective. Again, this also probably represents kind of good knowledge among our participants about nonviolent resistance. 38 is somehow effective, so almost 90% of the respondents says that civil resistance can be effective or somehow effective in against an aggressor state, and then 4% said that it could be counterproductive. Okay, let's conduct the third poll. Great. So here quite a lot would recognize this issue that I discussed at the beginning about the costs and kind of long-term consequences, highlighting that that this armed resistance could be counterproductive. Although a sizable group says that it could be somehow effective as well, and combine that with that armed resistance could be effective and somehow effective, we've got close to close to 50% even, more than 40. So this is, I think, quite interesting results that correspond to a certain extent with the same question that Ukrainians were asked. And here is the result. Ukrainians in the same survey were asked about what kind of methods, whether armed or non-violent methods, could be effective against invasion and occupation. And kind of Ukrainians were divided, but still 1/3 thought that they could be effective. Again, our group is more kind of educated in the subject matter than overall kind of nations are. And still, Ukrainians said in 1/3 of the respondents that it could be effective. And then similar group said that actually armed resistance could be effective. The final fourth poll. And here majority would go with boycotts, and this might not be too surprising, given that stayaways and kind of more dispersed methods, which boycotts belong to, would be considered much less risky than it would be the case with, let's say, protest marches and going out on the streets, and particularly when there's a relatively brutal occupier controlling those streets and cities. This may expose, maybe unnecessary, to greater risks the local population. Boycotts might be the safest, some people would still chose some of the violent means that were listed in that survey. And this, I think, also corresponds well with the results for the similar question that Ukrainians were asked, again in the same survey. They were asked which resistance methods they would have joined in case of invasion or occupation. And in the blue color, you've got resistance methods that were listed to those respondents that would fall into the category of nonviolent methods. And even here we can see that the repertoire of nonviolent resistance methods are much kind of larger to choose from than it's the case with armed resistance. Here there are 3 armed resistance methods or violent methods that were kind of selected. In some cases, you know, the sabotage, Gene Sharp, for example, doesn't include destruction of property as a non-violent method. So here is kind of gray area. But generally, more people were ready to engage in non-violent resistance methods. And the same like it is with our group, most of the respondents in Ukraine selected those non-violent methods that fall into the category of methods of dispersion. It's like boycotts, you know, refusal to pay taxes, and kind of non-cooperation. And then you will see on the left-hand side what I refer to as a kind of human capital for non-violent vis-a-vis violent actions based on this information about the readiness to join various types of actions. It's essentially that human capital from that survey for non-violent is 3 times as large as the one that exists for violent resistance in the case of Ukraine, which again, this type of information I think could be very useful for engaging policymakers in the conversation about, so given that our society has such a potential for kind of human social capital to plan for and engage and contribute to development of nonviolent resistance strategies and methods in case of foreign attack, why we don't pay attention to that? Why we spend resources on violent means? Why we spend resources on armaments if the society is telling us something different from those surveys? Now, right now I presented you the kind of results from 2 surveys in 2 countries, but I could imagine easily that such similar surveys could have been conducted in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in other countries that you know, both faced with internal and external violent conflict, asking the population the question about the kind of preferences regarding the type of resistance or actions they could be ready to engage in. And I would take a intuitive guess that in many of those surveys we would see readiness of the population to recognize applicability of nonviolent resistance into the current situation, as dire as that situation might be, and the readiness to participate in nonviolent rather than violent actions. And I think those surveys in those countries could also provide openings for the conversation with the domestic policy elites about kind of focus on violent and military means instead of non-violent, as well as I think could spur a larger debate in the international community and among international actors about the rationale for providing military assistance rather than using those resources for creating infrastructure or strategic plan of how to harness these non-violent potentials that are in those societies based on those surveys, representative surveys that could be conducted in that environment. And the kind of final interesting, I think, thing that comes from Ukrainian survey that was much more detailed than the Polish one was the preference for either armed or non-violent resistance depending on the goal of that resistance. And when the goal was identified as for national defense as protection of territory in a more kind of territorial sense, and the more territory-based language was used in discussing the goals of national defense, more people would would prefer to engage in armed resistance, would kind of recognize that armed resistance is effective and it should be used. Whereas if the goals of national defense were defined more in populist-centric terms, in kind of in the context of defending population, then there was a greater inclination about among those respondents to think about the applicability of nonviolent resistance in that national defense. This may not come as a surprise for I think many of us. I think that the focus on civilians in the context of war makes the discussion of nonviolent methods rather than violent methods much more likely. And we, by kind of default, might start thinking about the costs that may not be so visible to the population if we have the discussion about national defense in territorial sense. Those costs might be much more pronounced when we start discussing civilians and the impact of war on civilians. And that may also open the conversation more to the recognition, even among the policymakers, about the need for and necessity to do planning in the area of nonviolent resistance rather than armed resistance. And finally, what I noticed from this Ukrainian survey that lasted 5 minutes per respondent, where they were given all those questions, and at the beginning and at the end they were given the same question about kind of the perception of effectiveness of nonviolent resistance. Those groups that disagreed, they kind of at the end of the survey they decreased, and the ones that agreed eventually at the end of the survey with that statement that civil resistance could be more effective than armed defense, there was kind of more support for it. That illustrates that within 5 minutes there was a certain learning process that took place among those respondents about nonviolent resistance. Within those 5 minutes there was a visible shift that there were more people kind of agreeing with those statements and less people strongly disagreeing with that statement because of this learning. Now, if this happened within 5 minutes of the survey, what could have happened if we had a more structured education about nonviolent resistance in high schools or universities that would last months, and with what kind of effect? If this effect of positive trend about thinking about nonviolent resistance was already observed in that short survey. This is kind of wanted to end on a kind of optimistic, I think, note also about the impact of the surveys themselves. And just very quickly before I proceed to the second part, just to highlight the main features of nonviolent civil resistance that most of you would be familiar in terms of the kind of basic definition of what nonviolent civil resistance is. That's consisting of different extra-institutional acts. I listed kind of three general acts, which are disruptive, constructive, and symbolic. And in fact, each of those acts or actions or methods have been used in anti-occupation struggles, and even symbolic resistance played a very important role in kind of anti-foreign domination struggles. You see the picture of it's a Polish pole vault sportsman. His name is Kozakiewicz. He actually, in that picture, he won a gold medal in 1980. That was in Moscow. And when those spectators, they were kind of Soviets, they were the dignitaries, Soviet dignitaries in that stadium, and when he was rising up, he had this kind of rude gesture to the kind of Soviet leaders, showing that Paul doesn't give up, and that was the time when solidarity was on the rise. but Brezhnev was still alive, and Soviet leaders actually asked the Polish government to strip the sportsman of the gold medal, to which they responded that this sportsman Kozakiewicz had a temporary muscle spasm that created this gesture, and the Soviets didn't press. But that symbolic kind of resistance inspired Poles very much, and that became kind of iconic picture, an iconic gesture used as a kind of symbol of defiance. Another example of the symbolic act during actual occupation is an example of whether those symbolic acts matter at all. This example shows that actually even most brutal occupiers could be unnerved by symbolic acts. So Norway was occupied by Germany during the Second World War, and Norwegians and Germans were taking together that was the only means kind of transportation in the cities, city trolleys. But Norwegians engaged in boycotting Germans on those city trolleys. In essence, no one was sitting next to Germans, and even if there was a free seat next to German, Norwegians wouldn't do that. And that simple act of defiance unnerved Germans to such an extent that they had to make posters that said that it's forbidden to stand as long as the seats are available. So the Germans will not be left alone and would not feel ostracized in Norway, and Norwegians would have to join and sit next to them. So that was an order, which again, it was on one hand, it's funny, and on the other hand, I think it recognized the extent to which that non-violent resistance, even symbolic one, unnerved Germans. And in fact, we've got excellent kind of historical account from the military historian who interviewed German prisoners of war officers about their attitude towards violent resistance and non-violent resistance when they faced while engaging in either occupying or invading other countries and cities and towns. And those journals indicated that essentially they felt puzzled and uneasy when they were faced with non-violent resistance. They felt at ease, and they felt like in the environment that they know very well and they know how to react when that non-violent resistance became violent. And this was when they could use all the military power they had in order to crush the resistance. But initially, when they were challenged by non-violent resistance, they would feel very uncertain what to do, particularly when that non-violent resistance was like Norwegian one, kind of non-cooperation, very subtle, sometimes could be more concealed, like underground educational system in Poland. Now, this is an example from Czechoslovakia, invasion in '68, where Czechoslovakians kind of engaged in non-violent resistance that prevented Soviets to capture Czechoslovakia immediately as they planned. The plan was to have control over Czechoslovakia within a week. It took up to 8 months to pacify Czechoslovakia, precisely because Czechs and Slovaks engaged in non-violent resistance. This is an example. Soon after the invasion, a newspaper, the national newspaper, the Daily, published what became to be known as commandments of non-violent resistance, how people should behave when the soldiers, the Soviet soldiers, would approach them. Don't know, don't care, don't tell, don't have, and so on. It was very simple, and those commandments were visible in different parts of towns, including on the roads. Here we've got we don't hear you, we don't see you, and there are key lessons that I see coming out from the anti-occupation struggles that I think are important to highlight. First of all, we see that the nation becomes united. It becomes, in order to be effective in waging nonviolent resistance, it becomes kind of unitary resistance force. That there is certain type of preparation for nonviolent resistance actions in the form of sophisticated even levels of communication, both overt and covert, about the necessity to engage in nonviolent resistance, more so than armed resistance, and using established civic networks. There is the nonviolent resistance is oftentimes quite agile in order to be sustainable. It's oscillate between more risky and less risky actions. Quite a lot of actions that would be more about kind of dispersion and boycotting and non-cooperation rather than protests and demonstrations. There are also attempts by the attack society to reach out to the occupying soldiers and to reduce the social distance. Sometimes, like in the case of Gandhi, he reached out to the society of the colonizer to convince the British about the noble goals because of the noble means that the Indian society and the nation embarked on in order to win the independence. And the British society was won over by Gandhi, which helped him in the struggle. So we see this kind of attempts and strategies to reduce that social distance, and then extending the battlefield kind of globally, internationalizing those struggles, particularly those nations that are facing with a very powerful occupier. They would try to reach out to different international allies for support and for solidarity, as well as for to create allies that would put pressure on the occupier. Now, why should democratic states pay attention to nonviolent resistance? As I earlier stated, because bad actors do. And I will run very quickly through this. First of all, if we focus on what Russia is engaged in, and we know so much, I will hear so much about hacking and disinformation campaign, but Russia also really pays attention to what they refer to as an extensive use of protest potential of the population. They integrated kind of non-violent potentials of the population in the military type of calculus, and this is included directly in the military doctrine that was adopted in Russia in 2014. And they have implemented the hybrid war that includes this kind of protest potential of the local population in the war against Ukraine. They in fact also used dilemma actions that are so popular in non-violent conflict in order to advance the military and political objectives. Here they used the humanitarian convoys that were sent to eastern Ukraine to deliver food but also weapons, and that put a dilemma on the part of Ukrainians whether to attack those convoys and then face the consequences, or to let those convoys go and also face the consequences. Now, there is this bright spot, which I call Lithuania, that I think shows the way of how to integrate nonviolent resistance into national defense. And there are a couple of examples that I think are useful to consider in the context of Lithuania. First of all, it might be easier perhaps for Lithuania to consider nonviolent resistance because of its own history of nonviolent civic mobilization to defend the country that was particularly visible in 1991 when where Lithuanians form kind of human chains and in order to protect government buildings, in order to stop tanks. They also issued a number of documents and resolutions that emphasize that primary means of the struggle for independence for Lithuanians are the non-violent means, and that's how they will defend themselves. And in 1996, Lithuania officially adopted the kind of non-violent resistance strategies into the national security law. However, in 2004, Lithuania joins NATO, and from now on, any reference to nonviolent resistance disappears from Lithuanian national defense planning, at least officially. There is a belief that NATO finally can provide the protection that Lithuania seeks and can defend Lithuania. So Lithuania no longer needs to kind of plan for mass-based type of resistance in case of invasion. But then Ukraine happens, annexation of Crimea, and suddenly realization that NATO might be irrelevant as a deterrent for effective defense against Russian hybrid war. And that was the moment where Lithuania revisits its kind of history and practice of nonviolent resistance and returns to that idea. And this comes in the brochure. Well, it comes first with the establishment of the department, which is called Civil Resistance, Mobilization and Civil Resistance Department, the Ministry of Defense of Lithuania in 2014, and then with the first out of 3 manuals that the ministry issues. The first one is issued in 2000, published in 2015, and recognizes upfront that civilian-based defense, which nonviolent resistance, is another way that citizens can face foreign aggression and plan for defense. And then in 2015, it adopts new kind of strategy for citizens and defense of the country that also emphasize civil resistance and as part of the civil resistance, protest, civil disobedience, and non-cooperation as strategies. It also embarks on a very thorough and I think relatively effective communication strategy to educate younger people about both threats but also about non-violent resistance. And adopts a new military strategy that includes references to nonviolent resistance, to improving skills in planning for nonviolent resistance, and then creating the kind of situation where the whole nation is engaged in resistance precisely because civilians can engage in nonviolent resistance actions. It then published the next brochure, which is kind of more, as they say, humorous and cheerful take on with regard to recommendations how to plan for defense, and they recognized upfront that civil resistance should be implemented as a long-term strategy to challenge occupation if that occupation happens. They produce information or shows what people need to do when they see little green men in action. Here we need to call a specific number. So this is about what I would call theater awareness or battlefield awareness. They say that in that brochure, people must be engaged in mass-based non-cooperation. They have to document repression, publicize that repression. Here there are references to reducing social distance between occupied and occupiers' soldiers, trying to divide aggressors, domestic allies, and neutrals by showing also the non-violent resistance nature of the occupied society, as well as kind of increasing solidarity and internal cohesion by helping each other in during that occupation. So in conclusion, kind of couple of factors that help a state consider adopting nonviolent defense. First, I think it's more likely that adoption can happen when the country recognizes, and usually that happens in the context of small countries, that they might not be able to repel foreign aggression using arms, that foreign invasion is likely to succeed and occupation might follow. So that's what create the openness to consider nonviolent resistance. Defense is again understood as minimizing risk and cost to civilian population. Sometimes the presence of ethnic divisions that might be exploited by a potential aggressor would compel that vulnerable state and society to rely more on non-coercive and non-violent means to ensure national unity and avoid being perceived as a kind of violent militaristic, both internally vis-a-vis that minority group that might not be fully loyal to the country, but also externally, not to give a pretext for that powerful foreign power to invade. And then, again, taking a long-term view on conflict and post-conflict rebuilding and reestablishment of democracy, that might be much more much more likely if one relies on non-violent resistance or non-violent defense rather than armed defense. That would usually have much larger costs both for the society and infrastructure of the country.
One of the participants asks, does nonviolent defense imply that we are talking in a context where colonization is complete or under process?
Yes, this would be a distinction maybe between invasion and occupation. Usually when invasion happens, it's unlikely that invasion would be just for the sake of doing invasion. Usually a country invades another country to occupy it, maybe kind of establishing occupation over a part of the territory and temporary, but that's so the kind of invasion usually would follow by occupation. I don't recall any kind of conflict specifically that would just be about invasion, particularly successful invasion without an occupation of certain part of the territory. So some people would say, and that also was discussed in 60s and 70s, that in the literature on civil resistance, that civil resistance might be perhaps more applicable during the occupation rather than invasion. It would be difficult to convince a country that has military, even if that military is much weaker than the one of the invading country, to kind of do nothing. So some people would say that first maybe a chance should be given to armed defense during the invasion, and if that armed defense fails, which would mean usually an occupation, that occupation that could be protracted, lengthy, it's better for the occupying society if that occupation is challenged via non-violent resistance rather than armed resistance.
All right, great. Somebody asks, is there any evidence that these same methods can work against internal takeover of a vulnerable nation?
Well, internal takeover could be perhaps understood as coup d'etats, and indeed there are a number of examples where non-violent resistance was used successfully against attempted coups, or coups that happened and then the putschistas were forced to relinquish the powers that they captured. So starting from Putsch Kappa in Germany in 1920s, that was kind of prevented by non-violent mobilization. Putsch Yanayeva in 1991 in Moscow, that in essence collapsed because Russian civilians in Moscow and St. Petersburg mobilized massively against that putsch. And finally Burkina Faso in 2015, when essentially the coup was those who instigated the coup were forced from power within a couple of weeks. The leader of the coup had to concede and give up the power. So yes, and I know that ICNC has selected a monograph and research on civil resistance against the coups that is being written by Professor Steven Zunes. So we will have, I think, even more data and interesting information about how civil resistance is used in this kind of internal type of conflicts, in this case specifically against the coups.
All right, great. Somebody else asks, this question is specific to Lithuania, but how does Lithuania deal with the way in which the violent facets of the prospective resistance could harm and undermine the nonviolent strategies?
Yes, and again, it's I still see Lithuania as the country that is really advancing the nonviolent resistance planning and strategies, even though they do plan for armed resistance as well. And I think expecting any country to give up armed option, it's quite unrealistic. On the other hand, most of the countries would not consider nonviolent resistance in their planning to start with. So I think the recognition has to be given to Lithuania and the government, and including the Ministry of Defense, that they spend resources, both human and financial, on developing the strategies that are preparing Lithuanian society to face potential threats without arms, if needed. Now the question would be, just general question, and in a kind of more conceptualized fashion, which I think Lithuanians as well as others would benefit from considering, is to what extent armed defense could undermine nonviolent resistance. And again, I think some answers, mainly how to reconcile armed resistance with nonviolent resistance, might come from civil resistance scholars of the previous decades, such as Adam Roberts or Gene Sharp, when they were writing about civilian-based defense. One of the suggestions could be that even during the occupation, armed and nonviolent resistance could be carried out at the same time, but on different kind of territories. So armed defense could be carried in rural areas, in less populated areas, whereas populations living in the cities, in kind of larger urban concentrations, they would be all engaged in nonviolent resistance in order to reduce the collateral damage. I haven't seen that type of level of planning in Lithuania in terms of kind of sequencing or dividing those two types of resistance based on territory and based on different phases. But this might be one way to reconcile, while being realistic, that it's probably, again, unrealistic to expect from countries to give up the right to armed defense.
All right, great. Somebody asks, are strong democratic institutions and support of civil society by the domestic government necessary conditions for a nonviolent resistance to a foreign occupier?
Yes, I always think whether Saddam Hussein could have been much more effective in defending himself against U.S. invasion in 2003 had he used nonviolent resistance rather than armed resistance. And I would say that he could have been more effective. Maybe he could have been even more alive today. But I would say that for him it would have been impossible to organize nonviolent resistance, which is based around unity, national unity. And he would have been unable to organize effective nonviolent resistance against, if not invasion, then occupation, precisely because he ruled, brutally, in authoritarian fashion, being a leader of a minority, suppressing majority. So yes, the authoritarian rule wasn't conducive to create, I think, effective nonviolent resistance that would lead to this establishment of the kind of united nation and that united force against foreign invader, precisely because of the weaknesses of the authoritarian regimes to I think, well, in his context, to kind of unite rather than polarize, in that sense, Iraqi society was too fragmented for Saddam Hussein, even if he was inclined, which he wasn't, to rely on nonviolent methods.
All right, great. Do you want to do more questions, Maciej, or should we?
I could entertain one more.
Okay. Somebody asks, has Costa Rica, which has no armed forces, planned for civilian-based defense?
Actually, by not having armed forces, Costa Rica, I think, is in a much better position to plan for any type of nonviolent resistance. And precisely because I think Costa Rica doesn't have armed forces, any type of invasion of Costa Rica would face a major international outcry and backfire in that sense. That might be, you know, a certain lesson and key maybe hint for other smaller nations that not having military in the situation where having military wouldn't change maybe the outcome of the armed struggle, meaning that the country would still be defeated, that probably not having military will certainly create a much more international outcry when that invasion happens. Now, the resources, you know, that would usually be devoted to armed defense might be then spent on planning for civilian preparedness to engage in nonviolent resistance. So, you know, Costa Rica has an internal police that is responsible for securing the law and order, and those kind of infrastructure might be used to, if there was such a need, which I don't think it is, to plan for nonviolent resistance against the kind of possible armed invasion. It might be more a need to plan for nonviolent resistance actions and campaigns against violent non-state actors and the kind of drug traffickers, and which in fact, if one plans for national nonviolent defense, I think the society could be then better prepared to face also other violent threats that may not necessarily come from outside and from state actors, but it may come from violent non-state actors. David, we can entertain maybe one more question if someone wants to ask that question live.
Yeah, I've been checking. Nobody has, let's see. Okay, here we go. Pancho, you are unmuted if you'd like to ask a question to Maciej.
Yeah, hello. Hi,
Hello, Pancho.
and all of you. I'm really happy to be here and share all these with you. I'm just, want to ask or make a comment when sometimes here in Latin America and especially in Mexico, we face like non-state actors like are quite violent and have a lot of power and also are invading some areas and territories of civil society when people have to face this kind of aggressive and violent actors in their own communities. How can work these kind of civil resistance actions when it's not a state actor but a non-state actor, it's outside the state, and any kind of international law, any kind of human rights regulations, how can work when they can use violence without any care of anything against people?
Yes, you know, one would probably need to, and Pancho, I'm sure you know you are aware of that, but for those who are not, you know, there are a number of examples of communities in smaller towns and neighborhoods of bigger cities that organize themselves to push back against those violent non-state actors. And I think the logic on in its kind of foundations is very much the same to the logic for planning for non-violent resistance against kind of external violent threats or generally against violent state, be it, you know, domestic regime or outside regime, which is first of all, it's internal solidarity and establishing mechanisms and kind of mental readiness to help each other in the context of that kind of violence that affects a community. Solidarity that may ask those members to resolve the conflicts between them rather than to go to the armed groups to seek for help. solidarity that would be based on not passing any information to the outside groups, to those armed groups, and not kind of, in that sense, engaging in non-collaboration, non-cooperation, passive non-cooperation with those violent groups, not being informants. Solidarity that's about providing shelter and help to those that might be sought by those armed groups or violent groups. And again, this could be occupying regime, it could be a gang. And then beyond that solidarity, establishing certain principles that neighborhood is governed by, or that community, local community is governed by, principles that might regulate even, carrying or not carrying guns when you enter those peace zones. And in some of those peace communities, like in Colombia, you would have specific rules about that no one, be it the government kind of paramilitaries or the insurgents, would be able to enter the village carrying the guns and treating everyone equally. So then no one has a kind of justification for repressing those villagers, because villagers are treating everyone equally. So one starts from organization of that community. Before kind of that community first is able to defend its own space, and then perhaps even push that space, enlarge that space, and push those violent actors outside, even more outside of that space, self-organized space of that community. And again, those same, I think, strategies and tactics would need to be used even in national nonviolent defense planning. That, I think, if it has to be, or if it aims to be effective, it has to be done on the local level. As much as on the national level. On the local levels, in those communities, in towns and cities, where people would establish those networks and mechanisms and guidelines and principles of collaboration among themselves in case of violent threats. It's a very kind of large topic for the discussion, but I think ICNC monograph publication on peace community in Colombia, I think it's a good, I would say excellent read that highlights how those villagers organize themselves against, or despite violence and against violent non-state actors, and despite repression and sacrifices that they had to commit. So I would start from that, and there are other publications about other communities, be it in Afghanistan, in the Philippines, also in some other parts of Colombia, that looks into the same phenomena of self-organization by communities to push against violent non-state actors.